The Nintendo 64 came about in an exciting time in video games, the 32 and 64-bit era. Thanks to graphics technology and computer hardware advancing at a steady rate, the early to mid-90s marked the first occasion that real-time 3D graphics technology was available at playable frame rates and affordable prices. When the Nintendo 64 initially launched in 1996, it was already beaten to the market by other consoles utilizing one variation or another of this new hardware, notably including Sony's PlayStation, which came about as a result of a botched partnership between the two companies. Despite being beaten to the punch by new rival Sony and old rival Sega with the Sega Saturn, Nintendo did have the promise of new titles in their already beloved franchises, and the fruits of their collaborations with 3D hardware giant Silicon Graphics, to help them catch up.
Whatever you thought about video games before, set it aside, try it, it's a whole new experience.
Nintendo also made it clear that they planned on expanding their new console's abilities in the future through hardware accessories, one of which emerged from the troubled development of the Nintendo 64 disk drive. But we won't be discussing the disk drive today. Instead, we'll be taking a look at the accessory born because of it, the Expansion Pak. Planning to make use of a specialized magnetic disk with more storage space with the disk drive, Nintendo obviously intended for developers to craft more advanced games, but to accomplish this would require a boost on the hardware level. Fortunately, Nintendo planned for this in advance, with a memory expansion slot placed right on top of the console for easy access by the consumer. However, this slot went unused for a few years after launch, being occupied instead by a little device called the Jumper Pak. Foregoing some of the more technical details, this device functions as something of a placeholder, allowing the console to boot without the planned accessory installed. A sticker is placed on top of the Jumper Pak to discourage tampering by the consumer before the accessory intended for the expansion slot was released. After all, the system will refuse to boot if a Jumper Pak or the planned accessory is not present. The lack of a proper warning might lead to more than a few confused tech support calls. I have to imagine at least one or two Jumper Paks were removed prematurely despite the warning. The development of the disk drive hit multiple snags, with the expected release date being pushed back from 1997 to 1998 to 1999, where it finally saw a release in Japan. While the disk drive was facing development difficulties, Nintendo decided to go ahead and release an accessory planned to launch alongside it, the Expansion Pak, early in 1998. This device contains an extra 4 MB of RAM. Since the system already comes pre-installed with 4 MB already, the Expansion Pak doubles the RAM available to the system, resulting in a total of 8 MB of RAM. While this may not seem like much by the standards of today's hardware, the Expansion Pak's RAM boost was nothing to sneeze at. Many Nintendo 64 games were able to make use of the extra RAM, usually through a resolution or frame rate boost. However, 3 games required the Expansion Pak to function, with 2 refusing to start up without it, and the other only offering a small portion of the game if the Expansion Pak isn't installed. These are Rare's Donkey Kong 64, Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask, and Rare's Perfect Dark. Let's take a quick look at each of these and see what the additional RAM supplied by the Expansion Pak did for them. Let's start with what is arguably the most unusual case amongst the 3, Perfect Dark. Released in 2000, Perfect Dark was the spiritual successor to Rare's smash hit first-person shooter GoldenEye 007, a game that I grew up with and absolutely adore, shedding the James Bond license but retaining the fantastic gameplay folks loved about the previous game. Unlike Majora's Mask and Donkey Kong 64, Perfect Dark does boot with the Jumper Pak installed. Majora and DK64 throw up an error screen instead. While Perfect Dark is technically playable without the Expansion Pak, only the multiplayer is available. The player is effectively locked out of the single-player campaign without it. The multiplayer is a lot of fun and was no doubt the reason many people purchased Perfect Dark, given GoldenEye's reputation for its excellent multiplayer mode. Those wanting to experience the single player will need an Expansion Pak to get it up and running. The multiplayer does have bots for those wanting to play alone, but a large chunk of the game is missing without the single player missions available. Once an Expansion Pak has been installed, the game will happily boot with all features intact. When compared to GoldenEye, Perfect Dark features some immediately noticeable improvements, including different types of AI, graphical improvements, especially in lighting, and a wider array of levels, many with wildly different themes. The game's cyberpunk setting really helps the game shine in this department. There's city skylines filled with flying cars, futuristic buildings full of lights with lens flare effects applied, and strange alien environments for the player to explore. The game also features cinematic cutscenes that are fully voice-acted, a rarity in Nintendo 64 games.
No signs of conflict, no spent ammo cases or bullet holes.
But there ought to be a rear guard at least. It makes no sense.
Perfect Dark was a game that pushed the aging Nintendo 64 to its limits. However, the single-player campaign isn't the only benefit of having an Expansion Pak installed. Perfect Dark also features a high-resolution mode, boosting the resolution from 240 to 480i. This does come at a cost though. The frame rate is notably much choppier while in high-resolution mode. Take a look at the difference in frame rate between high-res and low-res in this area of the game's first mission. While this is a more extreme example, the overall frame rate definitely feels more sluggish in high-res, with major dips being a common occurrence. The visuals do look nicer with high-res enabled, but personally I prefer the more stable frame rate of the low-resolution mode. Regardless, the option is always a welcome one, showing off a common benefit of using the expansion pack. Next up, we have 2000's The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. The long-awaited direct sequel to The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask tells a darker tale in the land of Termina shortly after the events of Ocarina of Time have taken place. As previously mentioned, Majora's Mask will not boot without an expansion pack. The improvements in Majora's Mask will be apparent to anyone who played Ocarina of Time. The game contains many graphical improvements, though mostly an increased variety of textures. The creative design of these textures give the game an art style that is similar, but more stylized than Ocarina of Time. The game also features some interesting effects during cutscenes that weren't seen in Ocarina, contributing further to the game's nightmarish atmosphere. Majora's Mask, being built upon the same engine as Ocarina of Time, does include many reused assets, such as character models being repurposed as new, albeit similar characters. However, this reuse of assets is cleverly integrated into the story through the game's setting of Termina being some sort of parallel dimension to Ocarina of Time's Hyrule. The benefit of the expansion pack in Majora's Mask isn't quite as obvious as in Perfect Dark, but they're certainly there, working behind the scenes to further immerse players in a tale unlike any Zelda game before it. Finally, we have 1999's Donkey Kong 64, another game by Rare. This 3D platformer features Donkey Kong and the rest of the DK crew, including a few characters never seen before this title, on another journey to put a stop to King K. Rool's plans. This game is set apart from the others by a persistent rumor regarding the reason behind the game's expansion pack requirement. According to the rumor, the development team encountered a game-breaking glitch during the development of the game that was solved with the installation of an expansion pack, resulting in Rare requiring the expansion pack for the game to boot. This rumor was contested by former Rare employee Mark Stevenson, art director for Donkey Kong 64, in a 2019 interview with Nintendo Life for an article on the history of Donkey Kong 64. In the article, Stevenson was quoted as stating, "This one's a myth. The decision to use the expansion pack happened a long time before the game shipped. In fact, we were called in by management and told that we were going to use the expansion pack, and that we needed to find ways to do stuff in the game that justified its use and made it a selling point. I think the bug story somehow got amalgamated into the expansion pack use and became urban myth. The game did feature improvements due to the use of the expansion pack, such as a more consistent frame rate. Changes weren't as drastic as those in later games, such as Majora's Mask and Perfect Dark, but arguably did justify the expansion pack requirement. Notably, the game did come bundled with the expansion pack when purchased new, saving customers the trouble of purchasing the expansion pack separately upon learning that the game required it. Majora's Mask and Perfect Dark did not include the expansion pack, requiring it to be purchased separately. This accessory did a lot to squeeze a little extra power out of the N64 during its final years, contributing to some of the console's best titles. If you have fond memories of playing these 3 games or others that utilize the expansion pack, please share your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear about your experiences. But that's all for now. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.